Good evening, and welcome to Nevermore Hollows, the twisted little town where the witches are ancient and a demon-possessed monkey foments chaos. I am Lafayette Faust, and I dig up the stories that the townsfolk would rather keep buried. Thus far, the moral of every story has been that good must stand up to evil, even if the consequences are grave. Resisting evil is the only way to stave off the ultimate ruin of one's soul. Tonight's story is a bit different. I'll let you decide if it's a story that leaves you inspired or shocked. So with that, I ask that you sit back, turn on a light, and prepare yourself. My name is Brandi Darkwater. I write this because should I be found dead, my story will answer a lot of questions for a lot of people. I'm a 25-year-old college dropout. I have no close friends, nor do I have any family. My parents were murdered when I was 8, and I lived in an orphanage until I was 18. I used to work the night shift for one of those delivery services that bring food to your door. I preferred that shift because driving around at night helps fuel my creativity and focus my passion. One day before work, I read a quote that said that if you're lucky enough to turn your passion into a career, you will never work a day in your life. Later that night, I kept thinking about that quote and got completely lost trying to find one of the homes I was to deliver to. I pulled my 1986 Jeep Cherokee into the weed-choked driveway of an abandoned farmhouse out on County Road 298 so I could try to get my bearings. I mentally retraced my path, trying to figure out where I got turned around, when I caught movement from the corner of my eye. My headlights shone on the old farmhouse. I focused my attention on the house, looking for further movement. And there it was again, in one of the second-story windows that looked out onto the high grass. The window was caked in dust and grime, but I could just barely make out the shadow of someone watching me. I felt a chill creep through my body, and I held my breath as I focused all my attention on the window. I was not completely convinced it wasn't just my imagination. Either way, I was not going to let fear take control. For half a dozen heartbeats, nothing happened. Then, suddenly, the window smashed open as a beast covered in dirty white fur jumped through, hopped onto the roof, and plopped down into the driveway in front of me. It stood in the wash of my headlights. It was 5 feet tall. Its body was a hybrid of man and some kind of rat. Its arms were long and lean and ended in sharp claws. It had a long, naked rat tail that whipped back and forth. When I looked upon its face, I realized it was the face of an opossum. Its beady red eyes glowed in my headlights, and its fearsome rat sneer showed a snout full of razor-sharp teeth. I yanked the Cherokee into reverse and slammed my foot down on the accelerator. I whipped around in the grass and snatched the car into drive. The wheels spun in the tall, dew-wet grass. The opossum man gave a hissy shriek and jumped onto the hood, clawing at the windshield. The tires bit into the earth and the car jolted forward. The beast slid off the hood, leaving ragged scratches in my paint. I glanced into my rearview mirror. In the bloody splash of taillights, I saw it roll across the driveway and come up into a crouch. Instead of giving chase, it shrieked its rage into the dark night. The encounter with Opossum Man was my first encounter with the supernatural beings that haunt Nevermore Hollows. But it wasn't the last. Hell, it isn't even the scariest, and it damn sure isn't the weirdest. The encounter was profound not only because it opened my eyes to the reality of the supernatural, but also because it was the moment that gave me an idea on how to turn my passion into a career by starting my own business. Before I get to that part of the story, I'll say that scientists would call what I saw a cryptid, and then tell me that it can't possibly exist. But Opossum Man was real. And if he was real, then I had to consider the idea that so was Bigfoot. So was Nessie. And what about other types of beings, such as ghosts and vampires? I was consumed with finding everything I could about cryptids and monsters. I searched the internet and ultimately ended up at the library. I was surprised to discover that Nevermore Hollow's library houses a large number of old books, some dating back to the founding of the town 500 years ago. As I scoured those old books, I found a diary from a woman named Miriam Weston, who had lived in Nevermore Hollows until she died in 1692. In her diary, she mentioned a witch who lived in the dark woods of Dunwich Forest named Granny Dingo. I couldn't believe what I'd found. There is a rundown trailer park 5 miles outside of town called the Pink Flamingos Trailer Park. Ever since I was a little girl, I'd heard of an old crone who lived there named Granny Dingo. The kids always told stories about her being a witch and that the mangy dingo that followed her around was her familiar. Could the Granny Dingo in this 300-year-old diary be the same woman? I had to find out. So, I went to the trailer park to find her. It was late afternoon when I parked beside the teal-colored block building that served as the park's office. The door was locked. I didn't want to go knocking on doors because the park was inhabited not only by the poorest of those who lived in Nevermore Hollows, but also by some very dangerous people. As I considered my next move, 2 boys came zooming by on their rusty bikes. I flagged them down and asked them if they knew where I could find Granny Dingo. The first boy introduced himself as Rory Boudreau. "Yeah, we shall know where to find that old witch. What do you want with her?" "I want to ask her some questions," I replied, charmed by his Cajun patois. The other boy, who had introduced himself as Stevie Muse, said, "Granny Dingo isn't a woman who likes visitors." "And her mean old dog just might go and bite your leg off," Rory said. "I'll take my chances," I replied. "It's really important that I speak with her." The boys exchanged a look. After a moment, they shrugged. "She is one scary lady," Stevie said. "She even named her dog Manson, and the name fits. It's 1 part feral and 2 parts evil. But if you're sure, she lives over in trailer 33. I thanked the boys and drove to Granny Dingo's trailer. The park was laid out in a neat grid with the lanes named with a nod to the space race of the 1950s. I turned off Apollo Lane and onto Gemini and drove toward the back of the park, which jutted up against Dunwich Forest. Finally, I found her trailer. The front yard was filled with a large herb garden. If she were in fact a witch, this was no doubt where she gathered some of the ingredients for her potions. I parked and got out of my car. I heard a low growl, and from under the trailer crawled her dog. It was big and rangy, with a snout full of sharp teeth. The front door opened, and Granny Dingo stepped down beside the dog. She wore a long black dress, her gray hair pulled into a bun and held in place with a withered crow's foot. "Not yet," she said. I got the sense she was telling the dog that she had not yet made up her mind to let him attack. "Are you Granny Dingo?" I asked. "What do you want?" I'm an all-in kind of girl. I set my mind on something and I go for it. And though Manson looked hungry and Granny Dingo looked as if she were about to cast me into the pits of hell, I was here and I was going to ask my questions. "I came across an old diary that mentioned you." "Ain't nobody knows me enough to mention me in a diary," Granny Dingo croaked. "This diary belonged to Miriam Weston," I replied. Granny Dingo squinted at me. "That be a name I ain't heard in a long spell." So are you the same Granny Dingo? She paused before answering, as if she were sizing me up. Yeah, I am. Now that you got that knowledge, what you gonna do with it? Last night, I had my first encounter with the supernatural, I replied, and I want to ask you a few questions. Granny Dingo grimaced. I ain't in the business of giving away free advice. But since you done shown yourself to be a capable woman, I'll answer your questions in turn for a favor. I believed this old witch had information that could help me turn my passion into a career. If her help cost me one favor, it was worth it. All right, what kind of favor? She gave a withered chuckle. Oh, little girl, it ain't no favor I need right this instant. It's gonna be a favor I might need sometime in the days ahead. Now, you want my help or not? Yes, and I agree to the terms. You answer my questions now for a future favor. Granny Dingo smiled. She raised a gnarled finger and made a sign in the air. I felt a sting on my forearm and looked down to see a red welt in the shape of an X surrounded by 4 dots. That there mark binds you to your promise. It gon' remain there to remind you that you owe me. When your debt done be paid, it will leave you. Now ask your questions. I stared with wonder at the mark, then looked at the old woman. Last night I was chased by a beast that was a hybrid of a man and an opossum. Do you know what that was? She nodded. I do, but you be messing with something that you ain't got no business messing in. You gonna get yourself dead, or worse than dead. What can be worse than dead? Ask Ezra Joplin. Who's that? He done be the monster that you was attacked by last night. He was a man before he got changed into that creature. How did that happen? I asked. Granny Dingo fixed her dark eyes on mine. He owed me a favor that he chose not to pay. And he done spent the last 300 years regretting it. My skin prickled with goosebumps. I understood that I was dancing on the edge of the proverbial pit, but I pushed forward. Are there ghosts? Granny Dingo nodded. They is. What about vampires? Her eyes narrowed. She hesitated before answering. Yeah, they is vampires, but they isn't what you done seen in the movies. They ain't even what you done read about in books. Real vampires be an abomination like no other. They is cursed like no other beast on this cursed earth. You be doing good to don't go looking for any vampire, little girl. I heard what she said, but I was not going to be scared away. Tell me about them. Granny Dingo sighed. You done been warned, but your mind be set. So I tell you, they is more than one kind of vampire. Some are like rabid animals that can't control their impulses to kill. They don't look human neither. Then they is those that look human, but they ain't. They is the deadliest ones. They are smart as humans and know how to live among us, feeding off us in clever ways, though they do still crave the kill. I was profoundly curious. How do they feed and not call attention to themselves? That ain't my information to tell. But the smart ones, they keep the wild ones like they is pets. Use them for protection like I use Manson here. They also got a leader. Her name is Fatima, and she lives here in Nevermore. How do I find her? If my question surprised the old crone, she didn't show it. She gave me an answer that I never expected to hear, though it made perfect sense. That's gonna be easy, she said. She owns the Nevermore Hollows blood bank. You show her the mark I done put on your arm. She will see you. Now go on, get. I'm done with you now, but I'll be calling on you when I have need of a favor. I left the park, my mind swirling with the knowledge that there was magic and monsters and vampires. It was nearing twilight when I pulled into the parking lot of the Nevermore Hollows blood bank. As usual, the parking lot was nearly full. The Nevermore Hollows blood bank did brisk business and supplied blood to the town and the surrounding counties. I walked into the lobby and stepped over to the receptionist. Is Fatima in? The receptionist was 20-ish, with blonde hair that flipped at the shoulders. Her name tag informed me her name was Clara. I'm sorry, but she isn't here. Could you make an appointment for me when she is here? Clara pursed her lips together. I'm sorry, but Fatima doesn't take meetings with folks she doesn't know. The blood bank was staffed with a nurse practitioner, a couple nurses' aides, and a handful of phlebotomists. The nurse practitioner was a striking woman, tall, fit, black hair pulled into a ponytail. I noticed she was watching my exchange with Clara. I had a hunch, and I said, Granny Dingo sent me. Clara shrugged. I'm sorry, but I don't know who that is. The nurse practitioner walked over. She smiled, but I could see cold calculation in her eyes. I'm Shelley. How do you know Granny Dingo? I'm a new friend of hers, I said. She said to mention her name and I could speak with Fatima. Shelley led me to her office and closed the door. How do I know for certain you know Granny Dingo? I pulled up my sleeve and showed her the mark. She took me by the wrist and examined it more closely. I feel the magic, she said. Why do you want to speak with Fatima? I didn't want to show my hand. I knew that confronting a vampire was dangerous and that I probably wouldn't survive the night, but this was something I had to do. It's a private matter. Shelley considered what I said. If you know the old witch, then you must know what Fatima is. I nodded. I do. And that doesn't scare you? I shook my head. No. After another moment of consideration, Shelley relented. You know the Eldritch Mansion. I nodded. Napoleon Eldritch, the patriarch of one of Nevermore's founding families, had built the mansion for his wife Clarice back in 1699. I do. It will be fully dark at 9 p.m., Shelley said. Fatima will be expecting you. The Eldritch Mansion is a massive French colonial that sits on 5 acres nestled inside Dunwich Forest. The black wrought iron gates swung open, and I drove the half-mile to the mansion, where I was met by a black woman who appeared to be in her 20s. She was tall and beautiful and wore a black suit with a purple tie. Welcome, she said with an African lilt. Come, Fatima is waiting. I was self-conscious because I had hidden inside my jacket a short wooden stake. I was surprised that the woman did not search me, and I followed her into the house and down a long hallway that was lined with museum-quality paintings. She pushed through an ornate door, and we stepped into a massive library. In the center of the room was a small table surrounded by chairs and lamps in such a fashion as to facilitate reading and discussion. Sitting in one of the chairs was a woman with deep red hair and freckles. She remained seated but motioned for me to take the seat across from her. She turned to the black girl and said, Thank you, Zuri. Zuri nodded and left the library, closing the doors behind her. I guess I was more influenced by the idea of pop culture vampires than I care to admit. I expected her to be brooding or from Eastern Europe or to even sparkle. But instead, she was pretty like the girl next door and wore jeans and a t-shirt. She looked like a teacher or an artist, not a monster who drank human blood. I sat in the chair across from her, keeping my jacket zipped to hide the stake. I take it you're Fatima? I am. You say you know Granny Dingo. I sensed this question was a test. I only met her today. She told me how to get in touch with you. Fatima considered my answer. Granny Dingo values her privacy, and she knows I value mine. You must have intrigued her. What is it you want? I knew that by being here and being exposed to the truth of her existence as a vampire, I would not leave this mansion alive if I could not convince her that I had something of value to offer. I've been trying unsuccessfully to figure out how to turn my passion into a profitable business. But last night I had an epiphany. Fatima's expression remained flat, as if the conversation was on the verge of boring her. But her eyes read every blink, breath, and twitch. And what was the catalyst of your epiphany? I never knew monsters were real, I explained, until I was chased by one last night. It was half man, half opossum. Fatima reached over and plucked from the table a glass containing a splash of bourbon. She sniffed the amber liquid and took a sip. That would be Ezra Joplin. I'm sure Granny Dingo told you she was the one who cursed him. His story should have served as a cautionary tale to not get involved with paranormal beings. Maybe so, I said, but here I am, and I want to make you an offer, and I think you'd be foolish to refuse. Fatima raised her eyebrows at my last statement. You are a bold girl, aren't you? I nodded. Boldness is a necessary ingredient of ambition. You deliver food to the sheeple who are too lazy to fetch it themselves, Fatima said. That doesn't seem to be an ambitious approach to life. She thought she knew me, but she was wrong. Nobody knew me. Delivering food to these lazy sons of bitches is only a means to help fulfill my passion, I said. Fatima cocked an eyebrow. What is your passion, Brandi? And why should I care? I locked my eyes onto hers and I said, murder. Fatima peered deep into my eyes, reading me. Go on. On average, I make 10 deliveries a night, I said. I look for people who are alone, socially awkward, who won't be missed should they disappear. Once I find someone like that, I abduct them and I kill them. Fatima was swirling the bourbon in the glass as she listened. I'm intrigued, she said. But what does this have to do with me? Now was the moment for my sales pitch. I would either leave here a wealthy woman or I would end up as Fatima's next meal. I want to provide live victims for you. Fatima placed the glass back onto the table. She then leaned forward in her chair, placing her elbows on her knees. I can do my own hunting. Obviously, I said, but you have to be careful not to draw attention to yourself. You use the blood bank for food so that you limit your kills. Let me provide live victims for you and your kind. I guarantee you I won't get caught, and if I do, I'll keep my mouth shut. How could you possibly convince me you wouldn't give us up? I shrugged. I'm a serial killer, and we serial killers have huge egos. Should I get caught, I want all the credit. But honestly, the only way to really convince you is to earn your trust over time. I could see that Fatima was considering my proposal. I had to make my final push to seal the deal. I began with neighborhood pets, I said. My parents found out when I was 8, and they were my first human kills. The police had no clue it was me who killed them, and I was put in the local orphanage. During those years, I devised clever ways to cover my tracks, and because I vet my victims to ensure that they aren't missed, I've not caused any suspicion. Besides, we live in Nevermore. People go missing all the time. I've gotten very good at this. Fatima leaned back in her chair. How many people have you killed? Counting my parents, 27. Fatima looked at me with more appreciation than she had shown just moments before. How do you dispose of the bodies? I cut them into little pieces and take them to the swamp, I said. I always thought the gators and the snakes ate them, but now that I know that they're monsters, I'd venture to guess that there are other things that live in the swamp that make sure the bodies never turn up. Fatima nodded. There are. And I find it interesting that none of them have ever attacked you. Curious. So, this is all very fascinating and I admit impressive. I can see how my kind would benefit from a service like what you're offering. Bottom line it for me. How much? $5,000 per victim. I was surprised that Fatima didn't even blink at my fee. How would you handle the belongings they'd leave behind? None of the 25 I've killed since my parents have ever had anything much to leave behind. The landlord simply sold off whatever was left to recoup the lost rent. Fatima stood and slowly walked around the room as she considered my plan. This could work. We'd have to think it through to make sure we can tie up all the loose ends. You hire me and I'll work all that out, I said. She continued to walk about the room as she considered. I'm still not sold on you keeping quiet if you get caught. Look at it this way, I said. Who will believe that I'm selling these victims to vampires? Oh, there are people who know the dark reality of this town, Fatima said. They would believe you. But could they prove anything? Fatima stepped over to me and placed her hand under my chin and lifted my face so that our eyes were locked. I have spies everywhere, even inside the local and state police agencies. Should you ever fall under investigation or make a slip, there won't be anything left of you to arrest. I kept my eyes firmly on hers. That seems fair. Do we have a deal? She released my chin and I stood. She nodded. You start with me. If you do what you say you can, I'll introduce you to others like me. And you're good with the price? I asked. I want 1 victim a week starting tomorrow night. If you can guarantee that, I'm good with the price. And, just so you know, you will have no need of that stake you have hidden under your jacket. When you work for me, you have my protection. I gave her a sheepish look. I understand. She had Zuri show me out, and I got into my Jeep with my head spinning. I did the math. 1 victim a week equaled $250,000 a year. I couldn't believe that a chance encounter with the paranormal had led me to a way to turn my twisted passion into wealth. It was only 10 o'clock when I drove through the massive wrought iron gates and headed back into town. As I turned onto the country road, my phone dinged. I looked down and saw that I had an order. I smiled as I drove to pick up the meal, wondering if the person ordering would be my first dark delivery.